It wasn't the sound of war. It was the sound of freedom. Engines roared across the dusty plains of Ouagadougou as dawn broke over the Sahel. The air shimmered with heat and pride. Villagers lined the roads in silence, not in fear, but in awe as columns of newly delivered armored vehicles rolled past them, their metal frames glinting under the sun like silver oaths of sovereignty. It was October 10th, 2025, a date that will not appear in Western headlines, but will echo through African memory. While television screens in New York and Paris obsessed over distant wars in Gaza and Ukraine, a quiet revolution unfolded in a small, landlocked nation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Africa's youngest president, presided not over a parade but over a prophecy the day Burkina Faso stopped renting its defense. For generations, Africa's security had been outsourced, traded for aid managed by foreign advisors, and signed under contracts written in another language. But on that morning, in a ceremony free of foreign flags and diplomatic speeches, something irreversible happened. A nation took back its right to survive on its own terms. There were no Western generals watching, no journalists live streaming, only soldiers, farmers, and families, ordinary people who knew that what they were witnessing wasn't about weapons. It was about dignity. And as Traoré stood before his troops, unguarded and unshaken, one could feel the weight of history shifting. The West didn't hear the explosion, but Africa did. So here's the question every honest observer must now ask. When a continent begins to defend itself without permission, what happens to those who built their power on its dependency? Stay with us, because this is not just a story about tanks and rockets. It's a story about freedom, about faith, and about the end of the myth that Africa must be protected to be free. If you believe that truth matters more than headlines, subscribe, share, and stand with those who dare to rise. The morning sun rose slowly over the capital, gilding the skyline of Ouagadougou with a glow that felt prophetic. There were no marching bands, no colorful banners, only the steady hum of engines and the low murmur of an expectant crowd. In the heart of the city, a long convoy of armored vehicles emerged from the horizon, like an iron river, each one carrying more than steel. They carried meaning. At the front stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, no limousine, no foreign entourage, no security cordon. Just him, a soldier among soldiers. The youngest leader on the continent stood in combat boots, his beret tilted slightly forward, his expression calm yet unyielding. As the convoy halted, the national flag of Burkina Faso fluttered in the wind, not beneath another flag, not next to it, but alone. October the 10th, 2025. A day that will be remembered as the day Africa reclaimed its silence and turned it into strength. Before the assembled troops, Traoré didn't deliver a long political speech. There was no script, no teleprompter. He spoke in a tone that was steady, almost intimate. We defend what is ours, and we depend on no one to do it for us. Those words were not just sentences. They were a declaration of independence for a continent that had been told for decades that its safety depended on others. The soldiers did not cheer wildly. They simply stood taller, because they knew. For the first time in modern history, the weapons behind them were theirs, not leased, not donated, not stamped with foreign insignia, but purchased and delivered under African command. The equipment gleamed under the Sahel sun. Chinese-built Ninko VN-22 armored carriers, SR-5 rocket systems capable of long-range precision, and mobile air defense units. Each machine symbolized not just military might, but psychological emancipation. Every Burkinabe watching that day, from the soldiers on the front line to the farmers along the roadside, saw something their grandparents had never witnessed: an African army equipped, trained, and commanded by its own people on its own soil with its own money. For decades, Burkina Faso's army had operated under dependency disguised as partnership. Every rifle donated came with conditions. Every aid package came with policies. Before a single patrol could move, approvals had to come from offices in Paris or Brussels. Security came in envelopes signed, sealed, supervised. But this ceremony changed everything. What rolled through the streets that day wasn't just machinery, it was the end of an illusion. The illusion that Africa needed to be guarded, that Africans could not build or defend for themselves. No Western cameras captured the moment. There were no glowing headlines on CNN or Le Monde. Because how do you report the end of your own control? Across the capital, as the tanks rumbled past the old French embassy, the silence was almost sacred. Elderly veterans saluted, children waved, mothers whispered prayers. And yet there was no noise of celebration, only the quiet certainty of a people who finally owned their fate. Traore watched from the parade ground as each vehicle took its position. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The gesture itself was the message. The West might have missed the explosion, but history didn't. That morning, Burkina Faso didn't just receive weapons, it received legitimacy. The legitimacy to stand without leaning, to fight, without asking, to live without apology. And somewhere beyond those armored convoys in the villages and deserts of the Sahel, a new kind of patriotism began to take root. Not born from flags or slogans, but from the realization that freedom is not borrowed, it's built. That was the true story of October 10th, 2025. Not a military parade, not a transaction, but the birth of a doctrine, one that would echo across the continent long after the engines cooled and the dust settled. What happened next was not seen on television, but it was felt across borders. Burkina Faso's quiet revolution had entered its most dangerous phase, the moment when independence stops being symbolic and starts being real. For decades, the country's military had moved under the shadow of assistance. Every bullet, every truck, every radio carried invisible strings. Western officers signed off on operations, supervised logistics, and decided when and where Burkinabe soldiers could fight. It wasn't security, it was supervision. And Ibrahim Traoré had decided that supervision was no longer acceptable. He began with a simple but radical act: cutting the leash. Aid that arrived wrapped in flags and fine print was rejected. Donations labeled as support were sent back. Traoré redirected entire budgets once reserved for hosting foreign missions into domestic production and training. A nation that pays for its own bullets, he told his cabinet, decides when to shoot. Then came the economic maneuver that stunned Western analysts. Instead of pleading for new IMF loans, Burkina Faso opened new trade corridors across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Gold, cotton, and grain became bargaining chips for technology and equipment. Every deal signed carried one condition: no policy strings attached. Within months, the defense budget doubled, not through debt, but through discipline. That's how the Ninko VN-22s and SR-5 rocket systems arrived. Not as gifts, not as leverage, but as paid-for proof that Africa could negotiate on its own terms. But the real transformation wasn't mechanical, it was mental. Traoré understood that the deepest form of dependency is psychological. For years, African officers had been trained to wait for permission to delay action until validation came from abroad. Traoré's doctrine reversed that logic entirely. Hesitation, he told his generals, kills faster than bullets. Local commanders were given freedom to act, to trust their instincts, to fight based on local intelligence rather than foreign satellite data. Within months, insurgent camps that had resisted for years began to collapse, not because the weapons were superior, but because the soldiers finally believed that victory belonged to them. Across the Sahel, a ripple spread. Mali, Niger, and even Chad began studying the Burkinabe doctrine. A new military philosophy was emerging, one that fused patriotism with practicality. The West called it militarization, Africa called it sovereignty. Yet while the Sahel grew stronger, Western capitals grew uneasy. In Paris, diplomats whispered about regional destabilization. In Washington, reports warned that Sahel independence threatened strategic cooperation. The words were polite, but the panic was not. Offers of technical assistance began to arrive again, smiling envoys, friendly proposals, promises of partnership. But everyone understood the subtext: re-entry, the same control dressed in new language. Traoré declined, not with defiance, but with irrelevance. "We will work with anyone," he said quietly, "but we will depend on no one." For the first time, foreign military missions stationed in the Sahel found themselves sidelined. Operations once coordinated through joint commands were now directed from African soil by African officers under African authority. Western media avoided the story. There were no press conferences or think tank discussions because how do you narrate the erosion of your own power? But across Africa, the silence spoke louder than any speech. Young officers in Ghana, Tanzania, and the Congo began quoting Traoré's words in military academies. In Mali, murals appeared with his face and the slogan, "Security through sovereignty." The message was spreading faster than diplomacy could contain it. Burkina Faso had not fired a shot against the West. It had simply stopped obeying, and that was far more revolutionary. The world's most powerful nations found themselves confronting a truth they were never prepared to face. When a people stop asking for permission, empires begin to fade. That was the true explosion the West didn't hear. Not from the battlefield, but from the awakening of a continent that had finally remembered its strength. The revolution that began with tanks did not stop at the barracks. It spilled quietly into the villages, schools, and factories of Burkina Faso, changing not just how the country defended itself, but how it lived. Under Traoré's doctrine, the army was no longer a separate institution, it became the backbone of the nation. Barracks turned into workshops. Parade grounds became training fields for engineers, welders, farmers, and mechanics. Soldiers were taught to fix engines, as well as fire rifles to build, as well as to protect. It was a return to something Africa had forgotten, that the strongest defense is a self-sustaining people. Across the countryside, army engineers began repairing bridges and digging irrigation canals. Military trucks that once carried weapons now delivered medical supplies and building materials to remote villages. In some provinces, the army grew its own food. In others, it produced its own uniforms. What the West called militarization was in reality civil reorganization, a society rediscovering its rhythm through discipline. Traoré's philosophy was simple yet profound. An army that eats from its own hands fears no embargo. And that spirit spread far beyond the walls of the military. Young Burkinabe volunteers joined civic defense brigades, local networks trained to maintain order, guard schools, and protect farms from bandits. Women's cooperatives began producing uniforms and field rations. Local blacksmiths learned to forge spare parts for armored vehicles, creating new jobs and industries. For the first time in living memory, defense was not an expense, it was an economy. As communities organized, so did their confidence. The once fading idea of the nation, burdened by decades of dependency, was being reborn through action. When people repaired their own roads or patrolled their own markets, they were not just serving the state, they were reclaiming ownership of it. In the capital, government buildings began to run training programs, linking civilian life with military logistics, farmers learning supply chain management from army officers, and soldiers attending night classes in agriculture and mechanics. The borders between soldier and citizen were dissolving, replaced by a new identity, the builder-defender. Politically, the effect was seismic. The traditional opposition parties, long funded and influenced by external donors, found their narratives losing ground. Their accusations of authoritarianism failed to resonate in a country where participation was visible, practical, and local. People no longer measured democracy by ballots, but by results. When the streets were safe, when food was available, when dignity was restored, who could argue that the system was broken? Western think tanks labeled it a populist militarization of society. But to the people of Burkina Faso, it felt like something else entirely, a homecoming. The return of responsibility, the rebirth of unity. Farmers who once feared bandits now traded freely at border markets. Teachers who once fled rural areas returned to reopened schools. The national flag, once a formality, became a statement painted on shop walls, carved on school gates, sewn onto shirts. The transformation was not perfect. It was hard, uneven, and slow, but it was real and it was theirs. What began as a strategy for survival had turned into a new social contract, binding every citizen to the nation's defense, not by fear, but by pride. For the first time, Burkina Faso could look at itself not as a fragile republic under protection, but as a sovereign state under reconstruction. And somewhere in the heart of Ouagadougou, beneath the hum of the new factories and the distant echoes of drills, an old truth was rediscovered. Freedom is not maintained by words, but by the hands that build it. In Washington, the silence was deafening. Reports from the Sahel began arriving in classified briefings, each more puzzling than the last. A small, landlocked country without access to the sea, without major oil fields, without Western backing, had somehow achieved what decades of U.S. and European security partnerships could not: stability through self-reliance. For the Pentagon, it was a paradox. For the State Department, it was a problem. How could Burkina Faso, once listed as a fragile state, suddenly field a self-sufficient military, secure its borders, and rebuild civic trust, all without the guidance of the West? The answer was simple, but deeply unsettling. It had stopped asking for permission. Behind closed doors, Western officials began using new language. They called the rise of the Alliance of Sahel States as a worrying consolidation of power. They warned of authoritarian drift, of regional instability. But on the ground, the only thing spreading was confidence. Across Mali, Niger, and Togo, the Burkinabe model was being studied not as an experiment, but as a template. Governments that once relied on foreign bases were now demanding technology transfers instead of troops, partnerships instead of patronage. In Paris, the panic was personal. After humiliating withdrawals from Mali and Niger, France watched helplessly as its last military footholds in West Africa became symbols of a vanishing era. Once French soldiers marched through African capitals to applause, now their presence drew protests. The empire's shadow had grown too long, and the sun was finally setting on it. Meanwhile, American strategists feared a different loss. The narrative won. For years, Washington's message to Africa had been clear: democracy first, stability second. But Burkina Faso flipped that equation. Traoré's government argued that true democracy cannot exist without sovereignty first, and many Africans agreed. Western journalists tried to frame the change as a retreat from democracy. Yet for ordinary Africans, it felt like a restoration of dignity. After all, how democratic can a nation be if its survival depends on signatures written in another language from another continent? Even in Europe, quiet voices began to question the old logic. Perhaps one diplomat admitted off-record, Africa is not rejecting partnership, it is rejecting obedience. But nowhere was the reflection deeper than in the United States itself. Among older Americans, those who remembered Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the story of Burkina Faso sounded hauntingly familiar. Another small nation defying global expectations, choosing self-determination over dependency. It raised uncomfortable questions. Had the West confused control with cooperation? Had it mistaken dependency for development? And if so, what happens when those being helped no longer want to be helped? Across Africa, the ripple became a current. Each successful convoy, each locally built factory, each village patrolled without foreign oversight chipped away at the myth that Africa must be saved from itself. The Western world called it a security crisis, but in reality, it was an awakening. And as one retired U.S. colonel reportedly said after watching the footage from Ouagadougou, they didn't reject us with war, they replaced us with purpose. That single sentence captured the essence of the New World Order taking shape, one where Africa, for the first time in centuries, was no longer asking what it was allowed to be, but deciding what it would become. The dust has long settled over Ouagadougou, but the echoes remain, not from explosions, not from applause, but from a realization that cannot be undone. A small nation in West Africa has changed the rhythm of global power without firing a single shot abroad. Burkina Faso's transformation under Captain Ibrahim Traoré is no longer just a national story, it is a global mirror. It reflects the cost of dependency, the courage of defiance, and the quiet dignity of a people who decided that survival must come without supervision. For the West, it's a warning. For Africa, it's a beginning. When Western analysts label this shift as authoritarian, what they truly fear is something deeper: the collapse of their own monopoly over what freedom means. Because if Africans can define freedom for themselves without aid, without permission, without apology, then the entire architecture of global dominance begins to tremble. And perhaps that is why this story matters, not only to Africa, but to anyone who still believes in the right to choose your destiny, even when it's inconvenient to those who once wrote the rules. In a world saturated with speeches about democracy and human rights, Burkina Faso chose something older and harder: sovereignty with responsibility. It's the kind of freedom that cannot be gifted or granted, it must be earned, defended, and rebuilt every day. But the question now moves beyond the Sahel. If one small nation could reclaim its dignity with courage and conviction, what excuse remains for the rest of the continent still kneeling beneath dependency? What excuse remains for the rest of the world still afraid to imagine freedom without supervision? The age of permission politics is ending. The age of participation has begun. And somewhere in that dusty capital called Ouagadougou, a young leader continues to remind the world that leadership is not about asking for help, it's about giving your people the belief that they can help themselves. So we ask you, do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's model of security through sovereignty can truly reshape Africa's future, or will the old powers find a way to pull it back into their orbit? Share your thoughts below. Because silence is no longer neutral, it's a choice. If you believe that truth matters more than headlines, if you believe that Africa deserves to defend itself without apology, then share this story. Subscribe and stand with those who rise, not with those who retreat.